We're going to continue in his absence on with the story in Joshua. Just as a point of review, the Israelites, they left Egypt about 40 years before this period of time. Moses has died. Joshua has now become leader. Israel is moving into the Jordan Valley. They've been doing laps around the Sinai for 40 years, and the older generation has died off, and the newer generation is ready to go into the Promised Land. And they've actually moved in, where we are in the story, they've moved in, they've come over the pass into the Jordan Valley. They've conquered several kings and several areas on the eastern side of the Jordan Valley. Then they crossed the Jordan River at flood stage. We've studied all that. And now they're camped out just a few miles away from the city of Jericho, and they're ready to attack the city of Jericho. This is not the city of Jericho, but it's a fortress that is described a lot like Jericho. That's quite formidable. Jericho is believed to be one of the oldest cities in the world. It had two walls like that city. But Jericho, the walls were 30 feet high. So that upper wall, if you look at it, the second wall, that's about 30 feet. The lower wall in that picture is lower than Jericho. So just imagine it actually even more fortified than that city. Jericho was built on a hill like that with these two walls, one wall in the lower part of the hill, and then the upper wall in the upper part of the hill. Somewhere about 25 feet in between the walls. The walls were 30 feet high. The outer wall was 12 feet thick, mud brick. So I'm 6 feet across. It's double my wingspan here. The upper wall was also 30 feet high, and it was about 6 feet thick. This city, the historians believe, had not been penetrated in 1,000 years. It had not been conquered for more than 1,000 years. So this is what the Israelites are looking at. And God says, oh yeah, you're going to have that city. No one gets in there without being invited. So let's say you're a Jericho sentry. You're walking up on that wall and you're looking out over the valley. Let's look at the next slide. Or you're a farmer in the field. That's about what you're looking at. That's modern day, but it's standing at about where Jericho was, looking across the Jordan Valley. It's 20 miles or so, the mountains across it. So, go every day, you're walking along the wall. That's the scene you see. Or you're a farmer and you're out farming that field right in the foreground there. And then let's look at the next slide. Within a matter of a couple of weeks, it's a very crude drawing, but I want you to realize 2 million or so people came through that pass and just spread out all over that valley. That, if those were people and tents and armaments, that is a terrifying scene, no matter how formidable your city is. So, this is the two sides. They had just come over that pass. They've conquered those kings on the Jordan, on the other side of the Jordan, powerful cities, even giants. They conquered some giants on that side. So God is very much on the move with his people. Let's look at the next slide. And just to review, that's kind of the geography. It's a trade route. That's one of Doug's slides. You can kind of see roads. See the red road off to the east, and then there's roads going up into Jerusalem and the upper Israel. So this was completely on a trade route. It's like 580 and 680. It's very much on a trade route. It's a trading city. It's a wealthy city. It's a powerful city. You saw the fortress. It's a very powerful, very wealthy city. Let's try the next slide. So those are mock-ups of the two walls. You can see there's a lower wall and an upper wall. On the picture on the right, also notice there's a foundation below the lower wall. So probably it was like that. You have a 30-foot wall, but it's probably sitting on 10 to 15 feet of foundation. You probably have pretty close to 50 feet looking up if you stood next to the walls. And then let's try the next slide. Let's see if I get to my gate. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll leave it there for a little bit. So Rahab, remember her? She lived in the wall. So she lived, it's believed to be right by the gate in the wall. The Bible says she lived in the wall. So they built structures in the outer wall. And gates in ancient times were customs offices. And they were very, very busy places. There was only, in a fortified city, there was normally only one way into the city through the gate. In Jericho, archaeologists say the gate was on the north side where the water was. And so there's only one way in and out of the city. So if you're a farmer and you want to sell your goods at market, you have to come in through this gate. And if you're a judge, the elders of the city would sit at the gate and they would judge cases, judge disputes, what people would bring their cases to them. There would be tax collectors and soldiers. And so just imagine for a minute the gate at that city. It's got farmers with carts coming in and out to market. It's got people yelling off to the side, disputing, somebody stole my chicken, and the elders have to sort it out. And then it's got soldiers randomly around, watching people, seeing do they have any right to be here or not. And then it's got some tax people, some people collecting tariffs on some of the traders, some of the foreign people. And you've got people from all over the world coming through this gate. This is what the spies hoped for when they went to Jericho. They hoped for a very busy gate, and they were somehow going to sneak in to the gate past everybody else. But unfortunately, if we remember from chapter 2, they were spotted. So they slipped. I think what happened is, so filling in the gaps a little bit, but it's important when you understand the city. I think they got to the gate and through the gate, but then they knew they were spotted, and they just simply found the nearest door, and they hid inside there. And the nearest door was the prostitute's house. And she lived in the wall, in the outer wall. And understand something about these two walls. If you had any money at all, or you had any prestige in society, you lived behind the second wall. As you can imagine, the second wall would be a little safer than the first wall. Because if you ever were under siege, the first wall and the people who live down between those two walls are the poorer people and the people who get attacked first. So she's a prostitute. She's not a person of honor in the city. Her trade is mostly with the travelers that come in and out. That's why her house was undoubtedly right next to the gate, the first door that those guys could find that was open that they could go into. So that's where she lives. These guys are in trouble. They get to the gate. They see high alert. They're afraid. They run into her house. And for this reason, they don't go into the city. They actually never get all the way into the city. And then you have to ask the question. You have to step back. You have to step away from faith in a little ways. And you kind of go, wow, these two good Jewish boys went to the house of the prostitute. And the scripture actually doesn't help you out. I'm giving you all kinds of color. The scripture just says they went to Jericho and they went to the house of the prostitute. Okay. Doesn't sound like a Bible story, does it? We have to realize these spies actually completely failed in their mission. They were supposed to get into the city and find out something about the military, something about the supplies. And this brings to the first point. You know, there's kind of this tactical level of life. The tactical level is where you and I, we set plans for our life. We decide we're going to go get this degree or go change jobs or get this job, or we're going to raise our kids in a certain way or get them through college. We have tactical plans, and we carry out step by step these tactical plans. That's what those spies were doing. Those spies had a very practical, tactical, sensible plan. Go check out Jericho. But they failed. So there's this tactical level of life, but then there's this faith level of life where God has his plans. And hopefully most of the time, our tactical plans and God's plan are the same, or at least in parallel. But here's one instance where they're not, where their very practical, very sensible plan was actually against or not the same as God's plan. I want you to imagine for a minute how these guys would have reported back to Joshua. Joshua says, well, tell us about the city, the supplies, the weapons, the soldiers. Well, we didn't quite make it into all that. Well, where did you go? Well, we went to the prostitute. To which there was probably a pause, maybe a discussion later. Okay, what'd you do after that? Well, we ran away. I mean, seriously, this is a complete failure on their part. Joshua needed to know how many soldiers. He needed to know if they were trained. He needed to know what kind of armaments they had. Did they have flaming arrows, catapults, boiling oil, large boulders to throw on people? Armor, this is the end of the Bronze Age and the beginning of the Iron Age. Do they have this new technology called iron? Do they have sentries? Do they have a schedule? Is there a weakness there? Is there a weakness in the wall? Is there supplies? Can they handle a siege? Is there water in the town? This is all the stuff they were supposed to get, and they never got. So these guys, these Israelites, are attacking this city that has not been conquered in 1,000 years with no espionage. But from a faith level, on a tactical level, they've completely failed. But on a faith level, they've been absolutely in the center of God's will. And what is interesting about the story, and Doug and I were talking about it, really this first section of Joshua we've been looking at, faith is manifest through all of these chapters, but it's manifest silently. In a way, faith shouts to us through their silence. Really, they should have been grumbling all along. And read the book of Exodus, and their parents grumbled a lot. They should have been grumbling. They should have been grumbling out in the desert. They should have been grumbling when they came over the pass to the promised land, and it's, we got to fight for this land. We got to fight people. And by the way, we got to fight the giants that the other people were afraid of. No grumbling, silence. Their faith is manifest by silence. At that river, realize no one, as Doug brought it out, no one could swim. Do you know what a non-swimmer thinks about water? And floodwaters raging? Silence. They were silent at circumcision. They were silent when the manna ended. They were silent when they came upon that fortress. And they're silent at the failure of these spies. And their silence really shouts out to us how they believed. They believed God was leading them. It has no effect on anyone. This bad news from the spies has no effect. They don't try to replace the spies and send somebody else in. They don't chastise them. And you know what they don't do? They don't worry and pray more. Oh, God, it failed now. We got to pray more. They're just okay. So what did their faith journey do for them? What did their failure in their tactical journey do? Well, they did the one thing God wanted them to do. They found the one believer in this godless town. It's a little like Jesus' story of the one sheep, running after the one sheep and leaving the 99. He put these guys at risk. They failed in their tactical journey, and they did exactly what God needed them to do. And this woman, Rahab, the one believer, she's the ancestor of David and Jesus. And you have to realize that if their plan worked, they would have failed in God's plan because they're not going to the prostitute. They would have made it through the first gate. They would have made it through the second gate. They would have gotten all that espionage and headed home. They would have missed Rahab if their plans had been successful. How on earth would these guys find Rahab if they were successful in their plans? They had to be chased into that prostitute's house. Their fear drove them in there. Then they had to be held captive there. They stayed overnight because they had to have a discussion with her to find out she actually had a faith. And then God gave her a bargaining chip to lead to her salvation. And maybe, I think the most important thing that they got from their faith journey was sort of faith espionage. What they found out was that everybody was terrified of the Israelites. And that encouraged the whole body. Walking in faith. That's what they needed to find out. So here's the question. Can we fail tactically in our plans and succeed in faith? Because I don't know about you, but when I fail, it pretty much feels like failure, not like success. I have this situation that I was going to just walk you through a thread in my life. About 20 years ago, I was working for my dad, and he was a miserable person, and he cheated me and mistreated me, and he was sort of slowly dismantling and destroying the business that he and I had built up for about 6-8 years. And I decided I have to look for another job, so I started interviewing, and I had a good pedigree. I'm a CPA. I was in healthcare, and biotech and healthcare was big in the mid-'90s, and I just kept getting closed door after closed door after closed door. So we had some life savings saved up, so I said, well, maybe I'll find an investment and I'll develop a business on my own and leave him. Because the tactical plan, which made total sense and had wisdom to it, was get away from this employer who happened to be my dad. The complication of being my dad is he wore my last name and he had such a bad reputation, it was bleeding out to me. So it's like, yeah, get away from this guy. Everybody I knew, get away from that guy. So the employment thing, I just kept getting so many closed doors. So I thought, well, maybe I can invest in something that I can develop a business. So it's the mid-90s. Something to invest in, maybe the internet would be a good thing. But no. I was much smarter than that. Not the internet. I invested in laser tag. And so smart, so smart. Of course, lost the savings, and that was a hard failure. So then as my own life progressed, within about a year after all this, my dad wanted money and he wanted to sell the company, so he sold to some investors off of Wall Street. They made me CEO of the company. We were building this company, and that was not fun either. But I hired Doug as my CTO. And so one of my best friends, I get to work with him. Then a couple years go by, and it was crazy there, so I quit, Doug left, and he and I started our own company. And then God continues to bless that and bless it. And then years later, we hire this guy named Jeremy Mann who takes over most of Doug's work, and Doug is freed up to start pastoring here at Creekside through the company's funds. And that whole path never would have happened if I hadn't failed tactically. If I hadn't failed in my very good plan in finding another job. It was a very good plan except for laser tag. It was a very good plan. But I had to fail. If I didn't fail, at least as far as my life goes, I would not be part of that, what God was doing. I had to fail. And that's these guys, these spies, they had to fail. God's plan would not be carried out if they did not fail. And I think for my life, this is the way my life works a lot. I develop a very sensible plan, and I fail in the plan, and God redirects me, and I end up down the road that he wants me on. But it starts with me having a plan. It doesn't happen all the time. Many times God blesses the plan that I'm trying to move forward on, but many times the thing that feels like a failure is simply a redirect so that God can give us a better plan. I'm going to talk more about that a little bit as we close. But let's pick it up in Joshua 6. You have Bibles in the seats in front of you if you want to pick that up or if you have your own. Joshua chapter 6, verse 1. Now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. This is different, by the way. Remember, the spies made it in before. What's happened is these 2 million people, they thought would be on the other side of the river for at least a couple months because flood stage takes a couple months to dissipate. So nobody gets across that river at flood stage, and lo and behold, God's miracle, within maybe weeks, they're across the Jordan River sitting just down the road. So whereas Jericho was open, and let me tell you why it was open because they were buying food, and they were probably trying to hire military because they know what's going to happen. So the gate had to be open when the spies were there, but now it's too late. The gate is closed. Nobody goes in, nobody goes out. Verse 2, then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I've delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have all the people give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the people will go up, every man straight in." Sounds like a plan. Please look at that town. Sounds like a plan. You see, when God has a plan, and I'm going to talk a little more about it later, there's really no way oftentimes for him to communicate the crazy plans he has for us, because we might not execute on them. This plan doesn't sound like a victory plan to me. Look at that picture again. Look at that fortress. They're going to march around and blow trumpets. I want you to imagine for a moment Joshua telling his generals this. Okay, here's the plan from God. We march around the city all the way around. And his generals, okay, all right, good. Sounds like we can scout it out, get in battle positions. Okay, so do we use flaming arrows? Charge the walls? What's next? No, Joshua says. No fighting. No, we bring trumpets. And we blow the trumpets. Okay, so what do we do the second day, Joshua? Well, we do the same thing. Well, do we charge it? No, just the same thing. We just blow trumpets. Probably ask about the third day, and by the third day, they're going, you know what, Joshua, just tell us how many days we do this. Okay, 6 days we do this. On the seventh day, we do something different. Great. What do we bring? Well, you just bring the trumpets. Seventh day, we walk around the city 7 times, and we blow the trumpets, and we shout, and the walls come down. It's a crazy plan. Just a crazy plan. And again, their faith shouts to us. They don't object. They don't grumble. They just take the plan. Hebrews 11:30 says, by faith the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. Do you see that? By faith. That's by Joshua's faith and by faith in all those people who set foot around that very scary city. Their faith shouts to us. Verse 6, so Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it. And he ordered the people, advance, march around the city with the armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord. When Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the seven trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets, and the ark of the Lord's covenant following them. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests who blew their trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time the trumpets were sounding. But Joshua had commanded the people, do not give a war cry. Do not raise your voices. Do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then you shout. That was very common in battle. The war cry was part of what terrifies the enemy. No. We're not fighting it that way. Be quiet. Be silent. Just listen to the trumpets. So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the people returned to camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord while the trumpets were sounding. What's the main armament? Trumpets. Don't forget that, trumpets. So on the second day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in the house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and the gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury. So, verse 20, the people shouted, and the priest blew the trumpets. There you go. No B-52s, no flaming arrows, trumpets and shouts. And when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout, and the wall fell flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. Wow. That's quite a battle plan. It's quite a battle. It's really some interesting, in verse 20, I want to spend a few minutes on, some really interesting attributes that are very specific. One is that the walls fell flat. It's an interesting way of saying it. So some people speculate scientifically today, if they believe the story, Maybe it was a sonic boom. Maybe it was the shout and the trumpets hitting the right harmonic and the right molecular structure of the mud bricks and blah, 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 blah. 12 feet thick, 6 feet thick. No, that's nonsense. But if it was scientifically okay, that would mean a sound wave which travels would be coming towards the walls and blowing the walls in. These walls fell flat. And what it means is these walls simply just crumbled on themselves. And if you remember from that picture, it's all built on a hill. So as they crumbled on themselves, these mud bricks, they all just became an avalanche down the hillside, both the first wall and the second wall. And what's really interesting about that is if you look at the next picture, let's see if I've got it on the next slide. I'm not sure I put these in good order. You don't have a picture of the wall? Okay. Normally when a conqueror invades a city, what they do is there's walled cities all over the ancient world, and oftentimes very thick. But like in Roman times, what they would do is they would use battering rams, and they'd simply just try to punch a hole in the wall. And that would kind of leave this V shape in this massive wall. And what that would allow them to do is then soldiers, maybe 2 across, 3 across, could run into the city and then they'd conquer the city. And I'll explain later, I think that's how the spies thought that God was going to give them the city. But that's not how the wall came down. So, I've been through Israel, and you look at ruined cities, like there's a city in Galilee that was conquered by the Romans in 70 AD, and it has just exactly the structure. 2,000 years later, you can see the walls kind of still there, even after all those years. And then there's this big V shape with crumbled rocks on both sides where the Romans bust through, and they conquered the city. So all through the ancient world, you could walk by ruined cities that had been conquered, and you're going to see the walls kind of still in place and these spaces where the invading army broke through. But in Jericho, for 400 years before it was rebuilt, all the walls were gone. There's really no point in that. No army wants to do that. All the walls are fallen flat. And it's interesting also in the other details. It says the walls fell flat, creating this rubble all the way down the hill. And then it says everyone went straight up. Well, that's not what you do in a conquering city. You make this one V-shaped hole in the wall, and you all go kind of single file. You don't go all straight up. You all have to get in a row and go into the city. They're making a very distinct point here. No, all the walls came down, and they had already circled the city. That just meant everybody ran straight forward up. And the fact that it fell flat, remember there were retaining walls that hold the walls. It fell flat, which meant all the rubble gave them stepping stones to step right into the city. It's really fascinating attributes. Let's read on. Verse 21, they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her in accordance with your oath to her. So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and mother and brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Well, wait a minute. This is contradictory. It said all the walls came down. She lived in the wall. How did they get her? What is interesting, the answer really isn't shown in Scripture. That's a contradiction. But 3,000 years later, archaeologists started to unearth Jericho. And by the way, when you read archaeology stuff today, realize what happened is the British Empire kind of controlled the world in the 1800s. That was when archaeology became a science, and most of the early archaeologists were British. They were the guys who dusted off the mud bricks. They were the guys who dusted off the stones and saw what was really there. Oftentimes, archaeology after that is people with interpretations coming and going, a lot of people say, I don't think Jericho ever existed. Well, you know what? You didn't actually dust the dust off the stones. So I'm going to go back to the guys who saw it. And here's what one of these reports was. On the north end of Tel Jericho, that's the rubble, the ruins of Jericho, the archaeologists made some astounding discoveries that seem to relate to Rahab. Again, we have this contradiction. The walls all came down, but yet she lived in the wall. The German excavation in 1907 and 1909 found that on the north, where the city gate was located, a short stretch of the lower city wall did not fall, as everywhere else did. And they're not saying, I didn't put it in this paragraph, the fact that all the walls fell was weird anyway. So all the walls fell, but there was one spot where they didn't fall. A portion of that mud brick wall was still standing to a height of over 2 meters. That's after 3,000 years. But it's clear that that didn't fall. What is more, there were houses built against the wall that did not fall. So the contradiction is settled actually 3,000 years later when they look at these ruined walls and they go, oh, there's one house that didn't fall. And I think it's kind of comical, later, back with the spies, these poor spies, they're negotiating this thing with Rahab, and they say, okay, we'll save you, but you know what? You need to put something on the outside of the wall, because we're not going to know where you are. These walls are 30 feet, maybe we're looking up 50 feet with the retaining wall, and there's windows in the wall, because people live in the we don't know where you are, who you are, and we've got to take the city and then burn the city, so we got to move fast. So you better put a red cord in your house so we know where you are. But God leveled all the walls. And there's Rahab's house sitting right there. And I love it. This little red cord just going in the wind. It's the only thing standing. That seems to be what archaeologists found. Again, back to Hebrews 11. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace. How many people of faith were there in Jericho? Seems to name one, and maybe her family. But we have to realize, we know that Rahab is a person of faith, and she negotiates for her family. But the faith we hear so clearly out of Rahab, there are others, but we don't know who they are. And we don't know how many of her family really went along. Sounds like brother and mothers. But you have to realize the dynamic of what happened. So she is in the outer wall next to the gate, probably the most dangerous place in a siege. The gate is made of wood. Many, many historical records show that that's the first place the soldiers go through because they can burn the wood and get through the gate. She's in the outer wall. It's very dangerous. Everybody in the city, by the time the Israelites were circling that town, they had all moved up behind the second wall, behind the inner wall. Every single one of them. The king would have wanted that. He wants to preserve lives because those are people who can kill the Israelites if they ever make it in. Everybody. It probably was mandated that everybody go into the inner city. So Rahab has to stay in the most dangerous place, and she has to convince her family to stay with her. So all these people, Rahab and whomever were in her family, were people of faith because there's no way they would have stayed there any other way. Verse 24, then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron into the sanctuary, into the treasury of the Lord. Another archaeological thing that bore this truth 3,000 years later, listen to this. The destruction was complete from the archaeologist's report. Walls and floors were blackened and reddened by fire, and every room was filled with fallen bricks, timbers, and household utensils. In most rooms, the fallen debris was heavily burnt. Both Garstang in 1906 and Kenyon, very famous archaeologists, Kenyon in 1950 found many storage jars full of grain that had been caught in the fiery destruction. This is a unique find in the annals of archaeology. Grain was valuable, not only as a source of food, but also as a commodity which could be bartered. Under normal circumstances, valuables such as grain would have been plundered by the conquerors before they burned the city. Why did they find grain? Because Joshua said, this is the Lord's. You're not to take one single thing out of that city that is not devoted to the Lord. So they took everything that was non-perishable, gold, silver, whatever, and they left everything perishable and they didn't touch it, which was really unusual for a conqueror. Verse 25, but Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites today. Verse 26, at that time Joshua pronounced the solemn oath, cursed before the Lord is the man who undertakes to rebuild this city, Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son will he lay its foundation. At the cost of his youngest will he set up its gates. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. No kidding. That curse that Joshua throws out there, I'm not going to spend any time on it, but 1 Kings, under the kingship of Ahab, I think it was, he rebuilds the city, and it happens exactly that way. And I wonder, why, until I study this again, why that curse was laid on this city. They didn't want it rebuilt. And I think it's because of the way it was destroyed. It was so unusual, and it's on a trade route. So everybody walking with their trade, looking at this ruined city, goes, wow, that's a destruction. That's not just an invading army. Every wall's gone except this little one house. Everything's gone. So in a way, Jericho itself, I think, was a standing stone for the Israelites and for everybody who walked by to see what God was powerful enough to do. So I get to the end of this book, or the end of this chapter, and I have really two major questions. One is, as I was hitting at before, how can my failure be exactly God's plan? Like these spies, they had to fail. Sometimes I make really smart plans, but God has to fail them. And the truth is, in Christ, there is no failure. There's redirection. There is no failure. There might be a failed plan, but the plan wasn't God's plan to begin with. But I really have no way of knowing. I mean, imagine Joshua hearing from God, well, I want you to send these two young men into the prostitute's house. Yeah, go ahead. It's a crazy plan. I don't think I would have believed it. Or God saying to me, yeah, I think you need to stay with your crazy dad boss, and then I'm going to have you go with some other people from Wall Street, and they're as bad or worse, but then you're going to quit. You're going to bring your best friend with you. You're going to start a company. You're going to make some money, and he's going to be able to offload his work and pastor a church. Oh, okay, sure. I believe that. See, I would never believe that. Even if the Monty Python funny cartoon Godface talked to me. Brian, here's you. Nothing. I don't think I would have ever bought into that. So for me, and I think for most of us, this is how our life has to work. We have to be practical. We have to walk through life with wisdom. We have to make plans. Then we have to be open for God to move us, redirect us. And if we don't, we'll miss out on his plan. Look at this next verse, Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways, the word mean plans, neither are your plans my plans, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my plans higher than your plans, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Our plans as sensible as they are. And you have to realize who you see up here. Sometimes I speak, sometimes I sing. I wrote this book, and I shared it with you guys. But at the core, I am an accountant. And I live in a box. And this is my box. And all my plans, they fit into my box. And so after 30-some years of walking with God, I know that if I got away with my plans, I would be really boring. And I'd have a really boring life. I mean, so much so that engraved on my headstone would just be, he was boring. Or, he was an accountant. Same thing. Okay, fair enough. So my straight path with God has just been, wow, I never expected that. And to this day, my dialogue with him is, look, I know you have crazy plans because your thoughts are higher than my thoughts. Your plans are higher than my plans. And think of the image, as high as the heavens are above the earth. Wow. How am I ever going to understand that? I think the way that I have to work this out with him is to be as smart as I can, try to act in wisdom, stay away from laser tag, and let him redirect. And that is not failure. It may feel like failure, but that is not what it is. And this leads me to the second question. How did these people really conquer this town? With trumpets and shouts. That's all they did. What does that sound like? It sounds like worship to me. They conquered Jericho with worship. And maybe we can say that's how we conquer in our lives. We conquer with worship. And by that I mean sort of the broader definition of worship, the blended word of worthship. That we place God in the worthy place that he is. We give him the proper worth in our lives and place ourselves where we are. We make plans because we can do that. We move forward because we can do that, but we let God fail our plans and move us somewhere else. Worship puts God and his plans in charge and you and me in the rightful place of following. Let's pray. Father, thank you that you are worthy of being our God. Thank you that your thoughts and your plans are so much better than mine. And God, help me with that tension, because that means it requires the failure of my plans. And help me understand that. Help me walk with you in that, Father. And help us all understand that that is the way you walked with Joshua and the spies, and that is the way you walk with us. In Jesus' name we pray.